And this evening we're looking at the Lord of eternity having a plan in time. So this morning we looked at the long discourse through chapters 7 and 8 and hopefully got something from it as we looked at the background to it and then how Jesus applies these things to himself. So we saw that there was a world of darkness. Jesus came to what should have been a festival where people would naturally be set up and ready to be accepted and welcomed. And yet as he came, it was unbelieving, it was sceptical, it was divided, it was abusive, it was even hostile. We saw, secondly, that Jesus was the light of the world that dispels the darkness. And so we saw how he applied the symbolism of the festival that he's gone to himself. We saw that as the great lights of the festival symbolised God's guiding through the wilderness, symbolised the hope of the Messiah who was to come to bring spiritual light to those in darkness. So it symbolised that real sense of hope. So we saw how Jesus fulfilled that for us when we believe in him. And then we saw a call to come into the light. These things on their own are not enough. We saw that because the people weren't changed, and we challenged ourselves. And we saw the need of the Spirit to open dull hearts and blind eyes, and saw that that was how it came through pointing to Christ and his work on the cross. And we said that when we look and when we believe and when the Spirit opens our hearts, then we find there a limitless supply if we will trust in him. I'd like to look at the same two chapters this evening and to pick out some further things from them that hopefully will give us some help as we live for the Lord. So the first thing I want to see from these chapters is that the Lord of eternity walks in time. The Lord of eternity walks in time. So throughout these chapters there's a constant debate as to who Jesus is. You can't miss it. As David read, hopefully you saw some of the to and fro arguing about who Jesus is, how can we believe you when you make these claims about yourself, and so on, back and forth, back and forth. If you use an NIV Bible, then you'll know that there are headings throughout. I think some of the Bibles do, some don't. So for example, chapter 7 in my Bible, I've got a 2011 NIV here. It heads it by saying Jesus goes to the Festival of Tabernacles. Now the headings were never part of the original text. They were never part there. They've been added by the translators to try and help us see something of what's in there. Personally, I feel uncomfortable with them at times. They don't always divide a passage very well. Sometimes they don't get the point of what's being said in the passage. And we do need to remember that they're not part of the original scriptures. But now and again, actually they're quite helpful. And they're quite helpful in a long passage like this, which we said this morning, when you read it, can sometimes seem a bit tedious and a bit difficult to understand, as they constantly keep sort of batting back and forth, back and forth. But the headings enable us to take a glance through and pick up the themes without having to go through the detail. So it'll differ if you've got an earlier version of the NIV, but in mine, which is 2011, you'll see, for example, chapter 7 and verse 25 is headed by saying division over who Jesus is. There's that great block that goes with it. Chapter 8 and verse 12 is headed dispute over Jesus' testimony. In other words, the claims as to who he is. How do we believe this? How do we trust you? Chapter 8 and verse 21, Jesus claims a dispute about himself, about who Jesus is. And chapter 8 and verse 48, Jesus claims about himself. You can't study these chapters without looking at who Jesus is and why that's important. And this isn't just a theme of these chapters in John, it's a theme that goes from the start all the way through the Gospel of John. So for example, if you turn back a page to the more familiar passage, the feeding of the 5,000 and then the walking on the water, in that account, as Jesus comes walking to his disciples, he says to them, "Don't be afraid, I am." Now, in reading it in the NIV and a lot of other translations, it kind of gives you the impression that he walks along and he says, "It's okay, guys, it's only me." But what the original says is, deliberately use that phrase, "I am." Don't be afraid, he says, "I am." You immediately think, well, I am what? But he just says, I am, and he's left hanging. And it's quite clear from that this was significant as he comes walking towards them. And that phrase, for a Jewish mind particularly, is full of significance, because people have thought back to the burning bush and God revealing himself to Moses, calling himself the I am. I am who I am, God says to Moses, adding, this is my name forever. I am, self-existent, without beginning or end. He always was, he always will be. I am means I exist. It means I'm above everything else. I depend upon no one. And Jesus says, I am, as he comes to his disciples. No longer is he the one speaking from the burning bush to commission Moses. But here is the I am being commissioned by the Father to undertake that great work of salvation. Matthew's account of the walking on water says that the disciples were terrified when Jesus got into the boat. By that time, they weren't terrified of the storm. They weren't terrified of the appearance of the water, or man walking on water, because he got into the boat. Everything had died down, but they were terrified because they got something of who this man was. This was no ordinary man. They understood something of his claim. And so from chapter 6 into chapter 7, it continues. Debate, argument, questions, answers, counter-questions, all about who Jesus is. He tells them over and over that God is his Father. He talks about having been sent by the Father. He talks about having been taught by the Father, of being one in purpose with the Father. He tells them that he is from above and they are from below. He says that if they knew him, they would know the Father. He almost certainly tells us in verse 24 of chapter 8 that he is the I am. It says in verse 24, I told you that you would die in your sins if you did not believe that I am he. Now the he is added, it's not in the Greek. He originally says, if you do not believe that I am. It doesn't come out well in our translations, but that's what the original said. But chapter 8 ends with Jesus' statement in verse 58. Let's read from verse 56. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. You're not yet 50 years old, they said to him, and you've seen Abraham? Very truly, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am. Before Abraham was born, I am. You can't get clearer than that, can you? Without beginning, without end, the Lord of eternity, the one who calls himself I am. Before Abraham was, he says. Before Abraham was, I was? No, he says I am, the self-existent one. And they got his point straight away. Verse 59 says at this, they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away in the temple grounds. They saw it straight away. This was blasphemy. And for that, their verdict was he should be stoned. And they immediately start picking up stones. He was claiming to be God. They couldn't, they wouldn't accept it. To him, he was a mere man. He must be stoned. It said that Jesus slipped away, and we saw this morning with the hundreds of thousands of worshippers, the festival, actually that was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And it's interesting, just as an aside, you look at John, there's all sorts of little bits and pieces like that confirm that the person that wrote this gospel knew what he was talking about. He wasn't writing 150 or more years later without the detailed knowledge. Lots of bits and things you think, that's accurate, that's true, that's trustworthy. Just a complete aside. But as we read it, we can trust it. John has been building a picture of who Jesus is from the very first words of his gospel account. So you look into John in chapter 1 and it says, in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. There was a beginning. But before the beginning there was the Word, who was with God and who was God. The Creator, the Lord of eternity. This is the picture that John is painting for us. And yet at the same time, he comes as one of us. The Lord of eternity walks in time. So John says in verse 14 of chapter 1, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. He comes on our side. He comes as the Emmanuel, God with us. The Lord of eternity walks in time. What do you make of this Jesus? One thing he can't be is a good teacher. You can't just say he was a good man. As C.S. Lewis put it, he's either Lord, or he's liar, or he's a lunatic. One thing he can't be is just a good man. He never left that option open to us. If he wasn't who he said he was, then he's an imposter, he's a liar. You have to dismiss him. You have to dismiss everything about him. We said this morning that Jesus can't just be an add-on to your life. And that's because of the spiritual darkness that we saw that is all around. We need something beyond self-help. We can't just add Jesus to what we've already got. But another reason why you can't just add Jesus to what you've already got, and that's because of who he is. He demands your attention. He demands your submission. He demands your life. He demands your trust. And he can do that because of who he is. The Lord of eternity walks in time. Before Abraham was, I am. The second thing you see in these passages is that the Lord of eternity has a plan in time. The Lord of eternity has a plan in time. We saw this morning that Jesus' brothers were surprised that he wasn't going up to the festival. They thought Jesus needed maximum exposure and publicity. And what better place than the festival? Jesus tells them he's not going because it's not yet his time. So if you look at chapter 7 and verse 6, get my page to open. 7 and verse 6, therefore Jesus said to them, my time is not yet here. For you any time will do. And so on he goes on. Quick reading, you might think that Jesus is just being cautious because of the physical threats. And in chapter 7 verse 1, it certainly looks like that. It says after Jesus went around in Galilee, he didn't want to go about in Judea because the Jewish leaders there were looking for a way to kill him. So he knew it was difficult. He knew it was a problem. He's steering clear because of the publicity. He's steering clear because of what that might bring. And his brothers don't get it. But is that it? Is that all he's saying here? When you start to look at John's Gospel as a whole, you quickly realise that the reference to Jesus' time, or his hour, is a phrase that is deliberately used. And you could say it's a very John phrase. He says, my time is not yet here, or my hour has not yet come. I had a look, and I reckon that John uses it, is this phrase, his Jesus hour, or his time, some 10 times in 5 different sections of his Gospel. So we saw it in verse 6. Jesus said to them, my time is not yet here. For you any time will do. He repeats it again in verse 8. You go to the festival. I'm not going up to this festival because my time has not yet fully come. Or again, chapter 7 and verse 30. At this they tried to seize him, but no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. Or you look over again to chapter 8 and verse 20. He spoke these words while teaching in the temple courts, near the place where the offerings were put. Yet no one seized him because his hour had not yet come. There is a time, there is an hour appointed for Jesus. The Lord of eternity knows the plan. He's aware of his identity and he's also aware of his purpose. And nothing's going to divert him from it. We sometimes think of Jesus responding to events, dodging the violent intentions of the leaders, navigating tricky circumstances and people. And so maybe you look at it and think, well, that's what he's doing when he delays going to the feast. He's responding to circumstances. He's navigating the threats to his life. responding to what's going on. But John is very clear here that the one who is in complete control is Jesus. He knows exactly what he's doing. He came as a man in apparent weakness, but he remains the I am. He remains in control of all things, and he awaits his time. His brothers wanted him to hurry. They wanted him to hurry up, to show himself to the world, to the hundreds and thousands of people who had come from far and wide for the festival. But Jesus is in no hurry. He knows the plan. He knows what he's doing. Twice it says they tried to seize Jesus, but they fail. Well, why was that? It says quite simply, his hour had not yet come. Simple as that, according to John. They didn't call the shots. God called the shots, and he still does. We can draw some lessons from that for ourselves. There's a lesson there that God is not in a hurry, nor should we be. We put things into his hand and we wait his time. Now that's so easy to say, in reality that's so hard to do. But sometimes there is no alternative, it's all we can do. Look back at Isaiah 55 and verse 8, those well-known words where God says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. As the rain and snow come down from heaven, and do not return to it without watering the earth, and making it bud and flourish, so that it yields seed for the sower and bread for the eater, so is my word that goes out from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it." And one day, you and I will look back and say that God did all things well. For now, there are times when we just have to patiently wait and trust and believe that God has a time for everything. We also have to take from this that God is in control and he knows what he's doing. There is a plan, there is a purpose to everything. God isn't pressurized to change course. Jesus wasn't swayed by his brothers' persuasions as they tell him to go and show himself to the world. His plans weren't overthrown by godless people who tried to take his life and didn't want anything of God in their lives. Not then, not now. In our chaotic world, that world of darkness we looked at this morning, we have to trust that God knows what he's doing. We have to trust that just as Jesus worked the time he knew was in God's will, so we trust our all into God's hands and to his sovereignty. So the Lord of eternity walks in time. Before Abraham was, he says, I am. Then the Lord of eternity has a plan in time. My time is not yet here, he says. But the third thing we see from this and as we look forward is that the divine sovereignty looked forward to a dreadful destiny. Divine sovereignty looked forward to a dreadful destiny. So Jesus' time had not yet come, but it begs the question, the time for what? Is this just showing himself to the world, as the brothers suppose? If you look forward to chapter 12, you'll see from verse 1 that it says that it's 6 days before the Passover, just 1 week before the Passover and the final acts. If you think about it, you read a biography. Most biographies, someone's death is just that sort of final paragraph or two at the end. Maybe even just a final few pages, but no more than that. Almost as a way of closing the book, of finishing the account. A final few words and thoughts. But John gives over nearly half of his gospel to the last week and then the last days and hours leading up to Jesus' death. And the language changes from chapter 12. So instead of saying his hour, his time had not yet come, we find in verse 23 of chapter 12 that Jesus says the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. He underlines it a couple of times as he recognises and senses the horror of what is to come. So you look at verses 27 and 28 of chapter 12. Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it's for this very reason that I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Divine sovereignty looked forward to a dreadful destiny. He says, now my soul is troubled, and that word troubled has the idea of being agitated or disturbed or frightened. Jesus senses what is to come, and he shrinks back, as he would do again in the Garden of Gethsemane. And yet he is willing to go to the dreadful destiny. Then in chapter 13, John announces in verse 1 that it's just before the Passover festival, and that Jesus knew that the hour had come. Here would be the true Passover lamb. This was the destiny. The cross awaits in a few hours. And as Jesus prepares for those final hours, you'll see if you look again in chapter 17 and verse 1. Pages sticking to them. Chapter 17 and verse 1. He says, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you. All things look forward to the cross. It was the reason why Jesus came. It was always to be his destiny. We thought this morning of Jesus as the light of the world. For Jesus to be the light of the world, he must first enter the world of darkness on our behalf. And so he is taken into the messy and the sordid horror of human sin. Ultimately a cross where there is total darkness. And in that eeriness he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? In order to be the light of the world, he first has to taste the darkness. But more than that, he has to bear it upon himself. And more than that, as 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. He must be sin for us. The horror, the dirtiness, the fearfulness of your sin and mine must all come upon him. One of our modern songs says, light of the world, you step down into darkness. And that's amazing and that's wonderful. But there's so much more. He didn't just step down into the brokenness of this fallen world. He took all its sin on himself as he faced God's righteous judgment. As that song goes on to say, and I'll never know how much it cost to see my sin upon that cross. And as the darkness comes across the land, and as that cry of forsakenness is heard, then with the eye of faith, you can see that Jesus was rejected so that I might be accepted. He was condemned so that I might go free. The sentence was for me, but he bore it in my place. He endured utter spiritual darkness so that he might be the light of the world for me. It was his destiny. He knew why he had come. He waits his time. So at every twist and turn, he knew what was coming. Every sacrifice he went to through his entire life pointed to that hour that was to come. And yet, he didn't turn back. The Lord of eternity could have summoned legions of angels to save him from his dreadful destiny, but he chose not to. And why was that? We say it was because he loved me and he gave himself for me. Have you forgotten who Jesus is? Have you realised the depths of what he went to for your sakes? Have you realised just how safe you are when you trust your all to Christ? The Lord of eternity walks in time. Before Abraham was, he says, I am. The Lord of eternity has a plan in time. He says, my time is not yet here. And the divine sovereignty looked forward to a dreadful destiny. Everything centres on the cross and what was to be achieved there.